Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back once again to the Studio Ghibli journey. It's been a while since the last one, and I'm Luke from RazorwireReviews, and I'm joined with my good friend Daisuke. How's it going, man?
Good. How are you doing, my friend?
Yep, doing pretty good. It's a nice, bright, sunny afternoon here in Wales, and it's late at night in Tokyo, I imagine.
That's right. It's around 11 p.m. here, but that's okay. I'm just getting started.
Okay. Well, we have a lot to talk about. I watched this film again this morning, and I just have so many thoughts. So we'll try to keep it brief, but also a little warning for anyone watching this. This isn't the movie. This is us talking about the movie because our previous two discussions got many, many thousands of views, and there's a lot of people who seem to be confused over whether it's a movie or not. So I advise anyone who wants to watch the movies to go and watch the movies. Buy the DVD, the Blu-ray. They're on Netflix in most places in the world now. Anyway, the film we're talking about today is Only Yesterday. It's a 1991 film directed by Isao Takahata. This is his second film for Studio Ghibli. And I want to just dive right in with your experiences with this because you posted a video on your channel kind of introing this discussion we're about to have. And I turned it off because I didn't want to hear anything. I wanted to hear it all fresh in this discussion. So, what were your first experiences with Only Yesterday?
So thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this film, Luke. It's a very special film. Ghibli or Studio Ghibli films, of course, are large in number, and I think many people gravitate towards some films and then other people towards others, of course, because of the wide variety. But I think for me, perhaps this film Only Yesterday is probably up there as among my favorite, if not my absolute favorite, because it has so many. I think it's very clever and it's very. It's also very succinct in many places, but quite profoundly so. But if I were to speak about my own personal experiences, is because I let's see the character of Taeko is, as you know, is portrayed in two time periods, more or less. And the earlier time period when she was younger, and in the late 60s Japan, this is a period where I think, I'm 40 years old, and my mother, when she was alive, many, many years ago, she and I watched this film, and she could relate very closely to the character of Taeko. And while the story beats aren't, of course, word for word exactly matching my mother's life experience, she did say to me after we finished watching the film, she did say to me that many of the things that young Taeko had experienced or had seen on TV, or the bits of music that were being played, or the little things about the fashion and the changing fashion sense in the late 1960s Japan, and these sorts of things, about the pineapple and the bananas, and about the music, and about the handbag, and all these little things. She said that she could relate to because she had very similar experiences. She was in a large family. She was the youngest of three children. She wasn't very good at math, but she was very artistic, and I think that's very similar to the young Taeko. And she was living in Japan, and she did relay to me that of course she loved Japan and she loved living there, but there were times where she felt like there were how should I put it, maybe some unintentional limitations on her outlook. Let me put it that way. And so those things and everything else in between were, I think, reasons why she really connected with it. And through her connection with the film, I really grew attached to it.
Yeah, so I heard you start to talk about that in your video, and it sounded really interesting. So I wanted to kind of wait while we sat down to talk about this to hear about that. That's really interesting. It very much leans into the time period of the 1960s in that second timeline of young Taeko. But yeah, the first time I saw the film was a few years ago. Me and Connie watched it in one of our movie marathons, and I was really intrigued by the premise. I'd read that it was essentially, I mean, the plot of the film is very simple. Young woman, 27, has an office job, has a 10-day vacation, decides to go to the countryside to do some farming. So instead of taking a break, she goes to do more work, but she finds it a kind of fulfilling work. And it's something completely different from her lifestyle in the city. And while she's there, she reminisces about her 10-year-old self. And that's the movie. There's no big conflict. It's all very minimal, I would say, and delicate, and so it's a very simple story, and I kind of was drawn to that. I thought that's really interesting because at that time I'd been watching all these big, fantastical Studio Ghibli films. I loved them and everything, but that's like, wow, that's a complete change of pace. So I was really intrigued to check it out, and it took a long time for this film to get released outside of Japan, or at least in a widespread release, because there was no English dub for a long time. Disney, who had taken over the Ghibli titles at some point, I think late 90s perhaps, maybe, but regardless, when Disney were doing all of the English dubs, they didn't touch Only Yesterday. And that apparently is because there are details in the story about young girls getting their period for the first time. And apparently Studio Ghibli said, well, we won't let you cut those scenes out of the film. So nothing really happened. And it really took them getting to the end of Studio Ghibli's, to date output when Marnie Was There was released, and they did the English dub for that. And once that was all done, I guess they finally got around to Only Yesterday. So I was waiting for the Blu-ray to come out before I could see it. So I think it was 2017 I first saw this, and I was really struck with it, actually. And I mean, there's lots to talk about, but I was really impressed with it the first time I saw it. And watching it again today, it just definitely improved even more, in my opinion. I love this film. And yeah, so do you remember when you first saw it exactly? Was it when the film came out, or was it later?
It was a little bit later. I didn't see it in theaters, but I saw
Okay.
it on VHS tape, the Japanese VHS. They had these very hard plastic casing.
Mm.
It wasn't this flimsy, thin paper-like thing. It was actually very sturdy, and they had these, I guess they're called clamshell
Mm.
cases, but they
Yeah.
had those VHS collector's cases, and so
Hmm.
I had one of those. It wasn't subtitled or anything like that, but it was really great to have on VHS. I don't think it was available on VHS in North America or anything like that. So I'm not too sure about its release history outside of Japan, but
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
not either. I just know that it didn't get like a widespread treatment like a lot of the other Ghibli films did, which is why it took so long for some reason. Another thing I read was that apparently there's a lot to do with the accents in the film and dialects. So okay, so you'll probably know about that. So it was kind of deemed to be a tricky film to dub into English, and I haven't watched the English dub. I watched a little bit of it last night, and it's Daisy Ridley, who most people will know as Rey in the new Star Wars trilogy. She plays the adult Taeko, and she does an American accent. And I think I've read that that plays into something to do with the accents. I haven't watched the whole film though. So what can you say about the accents and how that plays into the story? Because it's nothing I would have picked up on just watching it and reading the subtitles.
Oh, sure. So the language of the film is, of course, Japanese. It's
Hmm.
the Japanese language. Taeko herself as a character is uh, she's grows up in Tokyo, and she is also in when she's in her late 20s. She's also working in Tokyo, so she's a person who is a Tokyo person. So her Japanese is how should I put it? It's standard Japanese,
Okay.
and there isn't any. I guess there isn't any accent if you consider that to be the standard. And according to Japanese language, that's considered to be the standard
Okay.
uh, in terms of Japanese language in Japan. But then in the adult storyline, Taeko goes up to the northern part of Japan, Yamagata, the Yamagata area, which is actually it's very close to where my wife is from, and I actually go. It's not exact same place, but it's only about an hour or so away from where my wife's family lives. and so we always visit that area every year for New Year's holiday. But the that area in particular, Yamagata, has a very thick accent, and it's so there. This accent is very. It's such that many people who aren't used to the Yamagata accent have trouble understanding what people in Japanese say in the Yamagata accent.
Okay.
Some of the it's almost like, for some people, it's almost like a completely new language. If you get used to it and you understand the rhythms, etc., or you grew up in that area, you'll probably understand most of it. For instance, my wife is from not Yamagata, but Miyagi, which is the sort of a neighboring prefecture, but it's in the same general vicinity. She'll understand Yamagata. It's called Yamagata Ben, or she'll understand the Yamagata accent much more than I. I have much more trouble picking up what the characters are saying. So, for instance, when Taeko visits the sort of distant relatives, the husband and wife, and then the elderly mother figure, the couple have a rather prominent Yamagata accent. The elderly woman has, I would say, a very strong Yamagata accent. It's of course understandable in the sense that the language is not so complicated. It's a pretty straightforward set of dialogue that they have to further the narrative, of course. But it is there are, of course, very big differences in the Yamagata Japanese versus the Tokyo Japanese, and so I think that's what the accents are. Perhaps it might be similar. It's not a perfect comparison, I know, but it's sort of like, oh gosh, I'm not sure. It's this is maybe too. It's not quite the same, but you know how it's like in parts of Britain that are maybe near neighboring Wales, or near, like, for instance, I know, like, I'm a big fan of someone like Dennis Potter, and Dennis Potter always mentions the Forest of Dean, and sometimes he'll talk. In one of his interviews, he spoke in the Forest of Dean accent in English, but it was maybe very similar to Welsh. I'm not sure, but his accent when he was speaking in English was very. It was a very kind of a local dialect-driven accent, and I had a very difficult time understanding. But I think the point is that, because based on the locality, that English is very different from, say, London English. And so I think a certain similarity can be drawn. It's not perfect, I understand, but a certain similarity can be drawn between the Tokyo Japanese and the Yamagata Japanese.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's plenty of that in the UK. The UK has so many different accents, like from even just not even that far away. Where I'm from, some people have a bit of a Welsh accent. If you go maybe half an hour up north to the mountains, it's really thick, and they speak really fast as well. So it's like it can be really, even though it's the same language, you can kind of get lost in some of it. But I haven't watched all of the film in the English dub, but I did watch the first 10 or 15 minutes, and there's a scene at the beginning where Taiko's on the phone to her sister talking about, I'm going to do this farming for a week. And she and Daisy Ridley's doing an American accent as a standard for the character, and then she goes into like an exaggerated kind of like deep South American accent as she's talking about the farming. So I don't know whether that actually happens when you get to. I should have watched it to find out. That's kind of bugging me now, but maybe that's the comparison they drew, to take something like the American accent as a kind of just standard American, and then lean into it a bit more for the just to make that comparison, because that's certainly something I would never have got from the film itself, I don't think. As someone who doesn't speak Japanese, obviously.
Well, that's probably if they were patterning it again. I haven't seen the dub. I only know the film in the Japanese language, but if they're going to pattern it after sort of United States English, that's probably the only way that they could go if they really wanted to try to get close to the dialect intonation differences that are expressed in the original Japanese.
Although I'm wondering, do you think that getting a sense of the different dialects, do you think that is vital to the story or not? Because the way I think it in my head, I don't think I missed anything, but it's also part of the texture of the film that I think adds something if you do know about it.
I think so. I think it is rather important if we think about the thematic exploration in the context of Taeko's character. Remember, she is in essence a city girl or a city woman. And I mean, she's a city girl in the late 60s, and then she is a city woman in her early or her late 20s, excuse me. And so she yearns for something that she doesn't have, which is what is it? A hometown or a place to call home. It's always been Tokyo for her, but she's never been outside of Tokyo in terms of having a hometown like other people that she knows. So I think in order to further differentiate between the city and they call it the inaka or the country, but to differentiate between those two worlds, because they are really different worlds. I think the part of that is the accent. I think that's actually a very critical thing.
Yeah, not to get too ahead of myself here, but I did notice that the opening shot of the film, I love the opening shot of the film. It's a very small thing, but it's just this shot of the building, and it's like reflected, and it's just a beautiful shot. But it's that is the city, and then the final shot of the film is a car driving down a winding country road. So there's that very distinct contrast if you look at the very last and the very first shot of the film. Also, the first time I watched it, I definitely noticed the opening credits just screamed Ozu to me with that kind of the fabric and the credits. So I'm guessing that was an intentional homage. I don't know if that's something only Ozu did, or if it was more of a staple of other films from like the 50s. I'm not too sure, but it definitely felt Ozu-like in its approach to the opening credits, and I would say that some of the film is a bit like that too. I don't know if you agree.
When you say some of the film, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's for an animated film in particular, you would expect, I mean, for the majority of films that are made that are animated, they take advantage of that. They go big fantasy, action, adventure, that kind of thing. And this is a very simple story, just about people. There's one moment in the pineapple scene, and the opening shot of that, I think, is showing the family sat down at the table, and the camera, quote unquote, is outside in a different room, and you can kind of see the edges of the doors, and it's almost like that ground level Ozu perspective, just very, showing us them on their level. That just kind of jumped out to me. But just in general, just a family kind of drama that's told very subtly, I think. Obviously, it gets a lot different, than an Ozu film when we get to certain other parts of the film. But that was a comparison I kind of, it jumped out to me the first time I saw it, and it was even more strong the second time.
That's very interesting. I think you're onto something there. Yes.
The details of this film, I think, are what really makes it stand out from other Ghibli films, which is interesting because it's kind of a contrast where other Ghibli films stand out with their larger-than-life elements. This film stands out in the really small details. And Miyazaki's great with that too, but there was like just a little thing where at the beginning Taiko's on the phone to her sister, and that scene is just her speaking to her sister on the phone, but there's like a little beat where a cat walks past on the balcony. Just little tiny things that kind of make the scenes more interesting. Each shot has something going on that isn't immediately in your face. It's more the subtle details. And even the facial expressions throughout the whole film are much different than any other Ghibli film I've seen, I think. There's like the detailing of her cheekbones and the facial structure. It's kind of, I don't know, there's something different about it. It draws you in. It's a little bit strange looking as well because you're so used to it not having that detail.
Yeah, I think you're correct about that. I think that was one of the selling points of the film, or at least in terms of its technical aspects. And as far as I understand it, also the voice tracks were recorded first, and then the animation was created around that. So the animators had, as far as my understanding is, if it's correct, the animators had the reference of the voices in order to be able to further draw the actual facial features. I would say to sort of embellish on the point which you made, which I agree with 100%. I would say further that I think we can also make a distinction between the younger sequences, the late '60s sequences, and then the present day sequences. I would say that the 1960s sequences seem to have more of a haze to them.
Mm.
There is a, and then even in the facial expressions, it's hard to tell. There are the adults, of course, but they seem also very much. They seem less realistically portrayed than the present day sequences. I know that's not perfect, but I think the present day sequences have that more of a realistic depiction flavor to them, and I think that's on purpose, actually. But I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, definitely. The one of the things I noted down was that there's a lot of exaggerated expressions at times in the '60s sequences, particularly when a character gets really embarrassed. These little two lines will come under the cheeks, and like blue lines will come down across the eyes as well. And it reminded me of like a comic book. And I read that this was adapted from a manga series that was purely the '60s stuff of a young girl. And then Takahata had the idea to kind of frame that through, looking back. And that's something that interests me about the film, is just how we have a 27-year-old woman who, I know now that I'm in my 30s, I think that's not very old at all. It's still pretty young. And why would you look back, so soon? But I can relate to that. I've always been a nostalgic person. There's always, and for me, there's been very distinct eras in my life when I was a kid, moving to different places. So even when I was like 11, I could feel nostalgic about when I lived back home with my mum or whatever. So I've always been someone who looks back. So I could really relate to her character, because as she begins this journey to the farm, she starts falling deeper and deeper into reminiscing about her childhood. And I love the way that it incorporates that. It doesn't just cut to the flashback. Well, sometimes it does, but there are little devices. I think my favorite one is when she arrives at the farm and there's a young girl there who's kind of bugging, I think, her mum about getting some trainers, Puma trainers. And she's kind of like whining about it. Oh, but all the kids have got it and everything. And Taiko's kind of chuckling about it. And then she hears her younger self behind her. And she turns around. And in the room on the farm, we see into the next room, and it's the past. And it has that distinct visual style, and then we move into that. I love all those little flourishes. They just makes it more interesting and fun to kind of slip back into those memories.
Yeah, it's the way that the past and the present are connected or interwoven is actually one of the, I would say, more radical parts of this film, and that's what I think makes it very interesting. I mean, you reference both points very well, but let me just agree with you further when you say that on the one hand it is a very maybe realistic or traditional presentation of a particular kind of quiet story in one way of looking at it, but the way in which the two storylines, because they are two separate storylines, and even the late '60s storyline is itself very episodic.
Yeah.
So it's not like you follow a particular thread of a narrative. It usually has one. They're sort of like episodic short stories in a way, and whereas the adult storyline seems to be more or less of a somewhat of a through line.
Yeah, definitely.
In terms of the young woman's the adult Taiko's sort of self-discovery, but the way that the past and present, I think, interconnect with each other is very radical. And one of the examples that you point out is it's what you said about how it goes right into the scene with her wanting I think it was a handbag. And then there are other moments when you actually see the children in the present.
Yep.
It happens a little bit on the train to Yamagata, and it happens much later in the film in a very memorable way. Of course, I'm sure you'll get to it later. But those are other examples of how past and present are interconnected. But then there are other moments when they're just quite simply and I think equally as effectively connected with a simple edit.
Yeah, definitely.
Just from one shot to another, and I think even those are really quite powerful.
Yeah, they establish right from the beginning that how these two different storylines or two different versions of her life are presented on screen. Like you say, like there's a haze to them. Like it's almost like a minimal style of I don't say animation, but the artwork, like certain scenes in her childhood, like they'll just fade off into nothing, almost like what he did with Kaguya. Not as complete as that, but there's kind of a pastely kind of not everything is filled in. There's muted tones, and it feels like looking back on a memory. It's a great way of doing it, I think, because I think maybe we don't look back on our memories and see it like that, but there's this kind of, we don't see it as clearly as recent memories, I think. And so that's a great way of just depicting that, but also, like you say, when it's a simple cut to the childhood era, we know straight away. If she's not in the shot, we'll know that this is a scene that took place in the past as it connects. And I like the way that they connect it, whether it can be something like she sees a young girl who wants something kind of like a new pair of shoes, and she remembers when she wanted a handbag, and it just goes off into a whole kind of different tangent, and it feels natural. It feels the way you remember things when you're out and about in your daily life, and someone says something, and then you're, oh, I remember when I was a kid, and then you kind of get lost. So it's kind of a visual representation of that.
Yeah, also even in I really like what you said there, and I think also even in the earlier sequences, it does have that sort of faded haze of memory to the look of it. And then there are even moments in there where you suddenly get these really jarring, I mean, jarring in a very positive way, but I mean jarring as kind of surprising moments for instance, little bits of TV that she watches suddenly becomes part of the world that she's in, even for a split second, when she's singing a song from the TV to sort of pick herself up after that huge disappointment of not being able to be in the theater. Or there's a moment where she's right. She has that little encounter with the boy who has a crush on her, who is a big baseball star at school, and then after one of the matches, they meet each other alone in the street, I think.
That's such a great
they
scene.
have a very it's fantastic, and it's so simple, and it's exactly how that kind of encounter would happen with these kids, right? And they it's like, and all up to then, everyone around them has been doing all the talking for them, and just exactly. doing it in a terribly sort of a way that is not necessarily thinking about the people who are most involved in this thing. And there's really nothing there. It's just an innocent thing. But even amongst that, there's still embarrassment, understandably so, on both sides. But then the embarrassment is cut through with that simple question of, what do you prefer about the weather? And then they make that connection. And then he runs off, and then she runs off, but she runs into the sky and flies through the sky and the clouds, and has that wonderful romantic moment, which is carried through to her adult life. In just thinking about that moment when she's lying in bed at night, or one night. So even the memory scenes, or the 60s scenes, have this sense of a faded memory, but also kind of a sudden bursts of jubilant fantasy.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I love that scene, and that took me back to when I was a kid in school, and there'd be that, oh, she likes him or he likes her, and it's also exciting. Even if you're not involved, it's so exciting as a kid, because you don't really know these things, and there's kind of that hint of you knowing that you're attracted to the opposite sex or otherwise, and so you just get that kind of like tingling feeling, and then just the prospect of just interacting with a girl, or likewise when you know that there's this feeling that you might like each other. It's just like terrifying. When I was about 11 or so, there was a girl who lived near me, and I really liked her. And I just wanted to, like, I don't know, I just thought if I could just say something. And this one day I plucked up the courage to just say, oh, what school do you go to? And she told me which school. I was like, oh, cool. And she was like, yeah. And she just smiled at me, and I smiled at her, and then she walked off. And it was this mix of just like deathful embarrassment, but also like massive excitement. Like, I spoke to her, sent me off for the whole day. Like, I said something. Never saw her again. Nothing ever happened. It was just that kind of release. And so that moment where she walks up invisible stairs, and she begins to fly, and then she goes on her side, and it's like she's swimming through the air, and then she floats down onto her bed. And the bit that gets me is when you just see her like this, and her eyes are like depicted in like the kind of anime style where it's like really exaggerated. Like it's just wonderful, and it doesn't continue. We never see that boy again. I don't think it's just about one of those segments of youth. And one more thing I noted about that scene was that with all the muted tones of the past sequences, when she's walking down the alleyway and she turns around, she sees him waiting there for her. There's the sun up in the sky, and it's a real warmth to it. And I don't think we see much warmth in the tones of those sequences of the 60s, but in that scene when he's standing there, the sun is above him, and it's kind of like a warmth that comes down over that scene a little bit. But even just when they're standing there awkwardly, Takahata he lets it play. Like there's just beats where it's like a couple of seconds of silence, which is quite a bit in film terms. Just them standing there, he lets it play out the way that it would, and I think that makes it work even more than it would if you try to rush through it.
Oh yes, I completely agree. I completely agree with you. The soundtrack, the silence, moments of silence are just as important as the moments where there's dialogue or music or sound effect, as effective as those moments are, of course. There are many moments of silence in this film that I think are quite effective. You point out one of them. There are many more I'm sure that we'll come to, but yeah, I agree with you 100%.
Another thing I noted in the beginning of the film was like right off the get-go, her manager, I guess, at work asks her what she's going to do when she has a 10-day vacation. She says, I'm going to the countryside to farm, and he's like, oh, has your boyfriend left you? Which is really interesting. The expectation of what women should be doing is really interesting. I don't know whether, the framing of the 60s and the 80s is showing kind of a progression to where women in the 80s perhaps were being a bit more independent or not conforming to this idea of marrying, especially when we get to the farm and the family very bluntly kind of suggest marriage, and it's a little bit kind of, I know it feels like a bit of a culture clash, even though it's the same country, but it just feels like a different kind of ideology. And also her mother, apparently we hear through the phone her sister saying, oh, mother was saying that you should have gone with this guy or something. There was some kind of potential romance and she wasn't sure about it. That struck me at the beginning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yes, it's actually, I think it's one of the main concerns of the film, which is Taeko, which in her adult life is depicted in the film. She's 27 years old, and so I think the main reason, or one of the main reasons why her mother, and I think by extension her sister, are trying to, in essence, pester her about getting married soon. And even her sister says, you're not young anymore. You need to start to thinking about settling down. And I think part of that has to do with the type of people that Taeko's family members are. We get a glimpse of what kind of people they are in the young sequences of the film. But also we have to remember that, as you point out, there is a kind of, it might seem, even from the perspective 2020, it might seem from our vantage point now even much more, maybe for lack of a better phrase, politically incorrect. But we do have to understand that during this time, there were expectations on women, and one of those sort of expectations, and I know this from what my mother told me, and what other people in my extended family told me, which is that even up to the 1980s or so, there was a kind of unspoken there's this unspoken thing that some people held in terms of women needing to be married by a certain age, and that certain age tended to be maybe like 25 or so, 26. So when you get to someone like Taeko, who is a young woman who is working, she is living on her own, and she is not married, and she's 27, then you have these sort of expectations, these unspoken expectations of wanting to get married. But those are usually imposed or they are felt from the outside, which is why we get the Taeko, her character, not necessarily herself being interested in getting married. At least we don't see any, we don't hear any kind of, we don't get any scene with her or her boyfriend if there was any, or we don't get anything specific like that. I mean, the only thing we do get is with, it's not even, well, we'll get to the farm Yamagata section in a bit, I'm sure. But in this first part of the film, yes, the reason, I think the other main reason why her sister and then her mother, we're told, are kind of trying to push her to get married is because of her age. For that's just the way that certain people thought even in that time. And so I think that's one of the things that the film is really trying to deal with, is people in Taeko's position who were young, who had jobs, and they were living on their own, so they were independent, and they had a certain level of financial independence and freedom. How are they trying to cope with these sorts of, lack of a better phrase, traditional expectations, societal expectations placed upon them? And I think that's a very significant part of the film and of her own journey, as it were. It's a question, of course, whether or not she maintains her sort of independence, or what happens to her by the end of the film, or at least what we presume what will happen to her after the film is over, whether she is really independent or maybe she has succumbed to certain societal expectations of her. I don't know. I think it can be seen in a number of different ways, actually. But I think, in just generally speaking, I think that's one of the main concerns of the film.
Yeah, and I mean, we're kind of getting into it already now, but if anyone is still watching and hasn't seen the film, we will be talking about everything in the film if you don't want to get spoiled. Should have mentioned that at the beginning. But I don't think this is a film that can really be spoiled per se, but I suppose the ending is a little bit of a, that kind of wraps things up. Or it doesn't completely, as you say, there's a bit of ambiguity there towards the end. I'm looking forward to discussing that. But yeah, the notes I wrote down: expectations to marry, solitary. So I found that her character's she enjoys her own company at times. Like, I don't know, just the traveling sequence, she seems so kind of happy just getting on a train overnight, and I enjoy traveling, and I had a pang of envy almost, because we can't travel anymore. We're all kind of locked down in one position, and I don't know, I like having that time to myself when traveling sometimes. And the sequences where she's on the train, just sitting down, looking out the window, smiling, just with her own thoughts, which then manifest into the physical. The kids from her school are running through the train. That's such a wonderful touch, I think. And there's moments of magical realism in the film, I think, beyond just her remembering things. Like the scene when, is it Toshio? Is that the character's name? The boy who picks her up. So he picks her up in the car. It's early in the morning, really dark. I think it's raining a little bit, and they're driving, and he puts on this music, and she likes it, and he says it's this Hungarian music, farmers' music. And so as it's playing, suddenly the car is driving through bright, sunny farmland, and for a minute you almost think, oh, did the weather clear up? And then it just cuts back to the kind of the dark. So there's just a moment where she feels transported into a different place, and we see that visually on screen. Even at the very end of the film, when we see the kids again from her childhood, they're kind of running around following her, and Toshio trips over one of them, which is a moment where so those two worlds start to collide, and you're like, oh, hang on a minute, which I think is just a playful thing, but there's that kind of magic realism, which, yeah, so I guess it speaks to it, where it is a film that's very realistic. It's just a basic human drama, but the more I think about it, those flourishes go throughout the whole film. But it's done in a very subtle way, I feel. It never feels too, I don't know, it seems to fit somehow. It's just one of those weird things where it just feels like it was meant to work that way.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that will help me to kind of amend what I was suggesting earlier about the later sequences, or the present day sequences, being more realistic. But you're absolutely right. While they are realistic in terms of the facial expressions being animated, or the little details of the car and the cassette tapes in the cassette player in the car, and all this great stuff, there are, you're right, very sudden and quite interesting uses of to borrow your phrase, magical moments of poetic or magical realism. When they're listening to the Hungarian folk song, it suddenly goes into that sequence. I always thought it was almost like trying to depict like Hungary or something.
Yeah.
When it was suddenly sunshine and you see the clouds reflected on the water beside them, and then it goes back to the darkness of the early morning. That happens again later in the film when they're driving, and then there's suddenly some kind of imaginary take to the two of them sitting on some hay as it's being dragged along by a
Yeah.
horse, and some similar song is being played. There's also a moment when in the present day sequences, there's a connection made between two characters, and they suddenly reach over and then they join fingers
Yeah.
in a way that's a sort of like E.T. I think, so those and other moments of past and present coming in. So you're absolutely right. So even when the present day story is, I would say, anchored in a sense of realism, at least compared to the 1960s stories, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. There are still flourishes of a kind of cinematic poetry, and I think that goes to the heart of Takahata and the type of filmmaker that he was. I think he was always a filmmaker. If you just look at his body of films, I won't go into too much detail, of course, but if you just look at his body of films, I mean, you know this by seeing his films, Luke. But his films tend to do this. They tend to take really real. They take stories that can be centered on something that is real, like realism, but they are always punctuated very poetically with these sort of heightened realistic moments. And whether it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek moment or whether it's trying to make a point about something, I think it can be either way. And I think the moments that you describe, suddenly we get to these sunny vistas before we go back to the darkness of the early morning. I think that is a suggestion of how. I mean, I think it's more than just. I think it's more than just a kind of flourish. I think it's a flourish and a moment of magical realism that is meant to suggest that there is this imaginary, or there is this way that the characters perceive the countryside, and there's almost this kind of glorification of the countryside that is going on, at least primarily from Taeko's perspective. But I think we realize as the film goes on that there is also a sense of grounded realism and hardship and to the countryside moments. And I think those magical realism moments that you point out, I think really create a nice contrast that I think drive home further the exploration of that theme by Takahata. So I'm very glad you mentioned those.
Yeah, and now that we're talking about it, I've just had the idea that perhaps seeing those moments in the present day storyline, where, like you say, the two fingers touching and so on, it's not as much as in the childhood sequences. And maybe that's showing that when she was a child, as most kids, she had more of an imagination, and she's imagining herself flying off into the sky. And as she's an adult, she doesn't do that as much. But as she's remembering her childhood, it's coming back a little bit, and that the little finger moment happens, and the here and there, and the driving through the car, and it's maybe a reconnection to the imagination of her childhood, perhaps just seeping in a little bit more than it would when she was a kid. That could be something that's, but yeah, like the glorification of farming, and it's strange because you do have these sequences in the film where they're just characters standing around talking about farming and agriculture and the impact of farming and like different ideologies, like the organic farming that Toshio is very passionate about and so on. It's just the kind of stuff I don't know, you might deem boring to a general audience. I was actually surprised but really glad to see that it was a big hit when it came out in Japan, actually, and that it was the #1 grossing Japanese film in Japan of 1991, which was really, I was kind of like, I was surprised but really happy to hear that, actually. But yeah, yeah, like you say, maybe it's not just a flourish, maybe there's a little bit more to it. But that's what makes the film really interesting, I think. I think I would still enjoy the film if we had none of those flourishes in there, but they add an extra something that makes you think. And kind of the finger one was interesting. It kind of threw me off a little bit. I don't know. That was kind of the one out of the whole film that felt a bit jarring to me. But there's even just like little flash images, like the Puma logo, like just it's very strange, but kind of, in a good way, strange in a good way at times, I think.
And I think also there are many kinds of types of flourishes that the filmmakers are employing here. Not only do we see these flourishes of sunny countryside and imagining a sort of an ideal life in the countryside, but also these flourishes, as you say, are things that bring us back to our world, right? Because these are images or trademarks or little signs from a movie like E.T. We've seen that as well. So it's like it's almost like it's on the one hand we can say that these are maybe expressions of Taeko's own imaginative tendencies, especially now that she's thinking back to her childhood. But also we can always ask ourselves, from whose perspective are these flourishes really taking place, right? Is it from Taeko's perspective? I think it could be, and I think we can read all of them to be yes. But I think also at the same time we can also read them to be maybe maybe the filmmaker's voice,
Yeah.
or maybe some other voice other than the characters in the film, and so that makes those moments hopefully more relatable to an audience, and it gives more room for yet more ability to, or more chances to connect with the story, I think, because we can identify with things that we know, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I did also see in the childhood sequences, obviously the majority of it is from her point of view because it's things that she's experienced. But I started realizing, I think it was the scenes where when they're talking about the period and the girls getting their period and everything, and they're like kids going around and talking behind each other's backs. And at some point, we're away from Taiko's perspective. We're seeing these kids in like a scene on themselves, where she's not involved, so to speak. And so that was interesting. I was like, oh, so this isn't entirely from her perspective. And obviously, like you say, it's the filmmaker's voice kind of, fleshing that out for us as an audience. So yeah, there's lots of rooms to interpret certain things and get out of it what you want. For me, it felt it is a very personal film, but I connected to it a lot because I related to a lot of what she was going through, just in terms of looking back a lot on their past, but also she seems like a very solitary character at the beginning. What I liked was that there's this nice split where I didn't realize how long it took for her to get to the farm, for one thing. It's like 45, 50 minutes before she actually gets there. In my mind's eye, I felt like it was like 20 minutes and then we get to the farm. So there's a long stretch where she's just traveling and reminiscing. At the train station, she sees a young girl who looks a little bit like she did. Just these very quiet, introspective moments. And then when she gets to the farm, that's when it becomes more of a social aspect with her. And also, what was really interesting to me is that the first half of the film, for the most part, she's remembering these things. As the second half fleshes out, she's now telling other people these memories. So she isn't just keeping them to herself. At one point, we go into one of the memories. I think it's the memory about the bag, and when her dad slaps her across the face. And then we cut to her on the farm with a young girl who works there, and she's been telling her the story. So now Taeko is actually relating these memories, and she tells them about the play and everything. So she begins to open these memories up to other people, which I thought was an interesting progression throughout the film.
Yes, that's right. Right. So at the beginning of the film, or the first half of or the first third of the film, perhaps, before she goes on the train,
Yeah.
to Yamagata, there are the past stories about her wanting to go on her summer vacation somewhere, and the family doesn't want to go, or they're not going to go anywhere, so they end up going to a hot spring place. And then there's the story about the young boy and the crush, and there's a story about the young girls and the period. and other things like that. And then they go, and then the pineapple story. I think there's a when she goes to the train stations, there's a little pineapple stall or a fruit stand, and she walks past it and suddenly goes into the story about the pineapple and eating the pineapple fruit for the first time. And then right, and then the second half of the film, right, she's telling the people around her about these particular stories or these episodes. In particular, you're right, she's speaking about the handbag incident, which led to her father hitting her across the face, the first and only time in her life that he ever did that. And then the story about her performance in a school play or a school performance, which led to her, the university wanted to have her perform in their play, but unfortunately it didn't work out that way. And then she's telling these two stories, right, to the people around her. But we see the flashback. But what's interesting too is even the final story that she tells, which is about the young boy, what's his name, Abe-kun, is his name Abe, who is apparently, he was a transfer student, and there was some issue about him and his manner, and he wasn't well liked. But there was actually perhaps a lot of there were some reasons behind his kind of behavior. And if you notice, there are some flashback type things going on, but for the most part, it's essentially her talking to Toshio in the car at night. And I think actually that's a very significant thing, and it's a development of what you say of right. She is now, the first part is essentially her recalling or reminiscing, essentially by herself, and then we see her talking to some people around her, but still we experience her flashbacks, and then we finally see her talking, reliant, not necessarily as reliant on the flashback structure as we were all the way up to the film, up to that point. And so I think there is a kind of progression, and I think that's actually very important when we try to see Taeko's journey through this film, and perhaps see what she is thinking about herself, or how she looks at herself and how she perceives herself at the start of the film versus how she ends up perceiving herself by the end of the film. And I think that progression, and there's a change that goes on, and that progression, I think, explains what her choices are at the end. And also, I think it explains in a very visual way and a stylistic way exactly why she is so she is so almost solitary at the beginning, but gradually sort of opens up, as it were, and she is less and less reliant, shall we say, on the flashback structure, even though it's still very important. I think there's something that can be said there about Taeko's journey, at least as expressed through how the film uses the flashback structure as it progresses.
Yeah, I really liked the editing of the film, or at least in the way that the film is laid out. And there's some interesting choices, again, near the beginning when she's on the phone to her sister in the present timeline. And then we have a quick shot of her sister in the past timeline talking about something, and it relays to their present conversation, and it cuts back and forth. That's really nicely done. But one thing that I thought was really cool was when she meets the boy, and they're talking about the weather, and he says something about, I'm not sure if he says, I didn't write my name on the blackboard, because there's this thing written in school that has both their names together that implies that he likes her, which the other kids apparently did, not him. So he's telling her about this, and just by him saying it out loud, she kind of, I don't know whether it's her thinking this or both of them, but there's like a snapshot of that blackboard image, and it's so quick. It's like almost like subliminal messaging. And I think that's a really great representation of what you go through when you feel really embarrassed about something. It pops into your head, and then you just try and forget about it as soon as possible. It's just a quick flash, and they're just like, oh, let's just talk about something. I really thought that was a really cool minor detail. And again, it's the minor details that I think really just make the whole thing feel a bit more complete. It just, there's these elements of the human condition, where we think about these things and the way we remember stuff, whether we remember long stretches of our childhood or we remember something that's very kind of embarrassing from the near present, and we just think about it for a second and then shut it out of our minds. Where just a really, I don't know, I thought that detail was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought that up because I think the editing is one of the strong points. I if let me bring up another example, which I think is actually really important. At the very beginning, you already cited this moment was when I think one of her managers, I think it's maybe her department chief or
Yeah,
someone who
yeah.
can, and he says, right, did you break up with your boyfriend or something like that, and you get a quick cut, kind of a medium close-up shot, I think, of her face as she's standing there over his desk. And after he says that line, you see her face, and it registers kind of a surprise or shock, almost to suggest that the question was rude, because it kind of was.
Definitely.
Not kind of, it was very rude. But and so there's a lot that you can read in her reaction, I think. Is it maybe it was true? I don't know, because we don't get a sense of her romantic life
True.
before the film starts. So that there might be some element of truth to it. Maybe she was really just taken aback by the rudeness and abruptness of the question. Maybe it was something that maybe there were some other concerns about that moment. But I think the point that I want to bring up is that even that quick flash is open to many roads of interpretation. And so, yes, I agree. Even quick flashes or quick cuts or edits, even very brief ones, still create a kind of depth to this film.
Yeah. I mean, some of those, like the fantastical, like the cuts to the Puma logo or whatever, or the two fingers touching, like those are really quick cuts. But this blackboard thing, I must be on screen for like 2 or 3 frames. But I just thought that I don't know, I really liked that. I appreciated that. And I wanted to talk about the character of Toshio, which was I really finding him endearing. I don't know how you reacted to this character, but I like his earnestness, and there's a key like character trait that I think is really interesting. His little chuckle. Now, the guy who does the voice acting, the way that he performs this little chuckle and the way that his face is animated, it's such a disarming kind of likable trait. So that when maybe he's talking about all this farming stuff and then he'll just kind of laugh it off. And there's like a little bit maybe of embarrassment there on his part because he's, I think he likes her from the beginning. I think he mentions that he saw her the year before at when she was there previously. But even down to like, there's a moment when they're talking and walking, and he delivers this very serious kind of short monologue on like kind of his passion about farming, and he's doing it in a very kind of theatrical manner, and then he just laughs and says, "Well, my friend says that." I agree with him, but just it's a very disarming kind of trait, and I just found that to be really endearing, and you could see why she might like him. But I love this potential romance between them because it's never overplayed. I don't think it's apparent that there could be something there, but it's never like focused on too much, and it isn't made to be this grand thing. I don't know. That's the way I kind of read it. What do you think?
You mean about the potential romance between the two
Yeah.
characters? Yeah, I think it's more from him than from her.
Yeah.
There are moments where I think they're visiting. It's a kind of resort place called Zao, Mount Zao, as a kind of day excursion away from the daily life of the house, and that's where he asks, you never thought about getting married or anything like that, and she sort of brushes him off and changes the subject in a very polite way, of course.
Yeah.
But that's an example, I think, of perhaps he might be trying to express some kind of romantic interest in her, but perhaps she is not necessarily expressing a similar kind of interest in him, at least at that point. And that's where she brings up the whole thing about how did you get it's like, right, so you never thought about getting married? And she says, oh, I don't think so. And then, oh, by the way, were you able to get the thing about dividing fractions? So that's a really interesting way to change the subject, I think. But yeah, I mean, you probably should have gotten the hint, but
Yeah.
I mean, the film ends up in the way it does, I suppose. But in any event, yeah.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, there are instances where I think he tries to express a certain kind of interest,
Yeah.
or maybe trying to test the water, so to speak. But yeah, for the most part, she is not necessarily reciprocating
Yeah.
what it is he has. That's my view on it, anyway.
Yeah, when it comes to brushing someone off like that, her response is pretty much a brick wall, I think.
Yes, yes.
But
So
but I like the way he's portrayed, and so because I mean the ending is very much framed around like a potential romance between them, but also there's more to it. There's more like the idea of her changing her life, and maybe trying to seek more fulfillment in her life by perhaps taking up this country life, perhaps. But yeah, he never seems too forward with it. I mean that scene obviously he's kind of hinting, but he's very respectful. I feel like, and I just like the way that his character is portrayed.
oh, well, while we're on the topic, let me just ask you this question: if what do you think about the way that the film resolves Taeko's character? And to be more specific, if we see Taeko's character at the beginning of the film to be an independent woman, she has a job, she is living on her own. She of course has family members that she is close to. Maybe some family members she's closer to than others, but she is still an independent woman. And there is this notion of her, maybe not, I don't know if it's, she doesn't want to get married, but it's not her, that's not what she's concerned about at this moment in time. So this could be seen as a kind of statement, if you will, on this idea of independence, right? And wanting to find yourself through this journey without necessarily having to rely on a romantic interest with a man. Okay. But then the film ends in a way that suggests that she will get together with Toshio after the credits roll and the film fades to black. So I guess my question is, how do you see this kind of resolution to this otherwise discussion of sort of independence and this young woman's journey through independence without necessarily trying to find a relationship, but ends up in a kind of relationship?
Yeah. Well, her whole story is a bit. It's like the whole, almost like the hero's journey. You know, Luke Skywalker looking out at the sunset. You know, she wants to, at the very beginning, she wants to go to the country. She wants to experience something different when she's a kid. As an adult, she very much does that in full. And it's this journey of going out there. And, you know, we don't see much of her life as a 27-year-old in the city. But we can imagine it's very different. And she says at one point, I like my job. And there's that whole conversation between the two about living to work or working to live. And he talks about how he loves farming. He can do it 24 hours a day. So there's that kind of thrown in there. I love her kind of, I'll get back to the ending, but I love her kind of crisis of self-confidence when she's wondering about whether, am I a nice person or am I just pretending to be nice? I think that's a really deep thought, really, when you really think about it. When you think about if you're nice to someone, are you doing that because you are a nice person inherently, or because you're trying to be nice? And do the two things even matter anyway? If you're trying to be nice, maybe that means you're a nice person. But she has that kind of self-doubt, I think, towards the end there, and she's not sure what she wants to do. And when she gets given that kind of offer of marriage, it's very blunt and very. I mean, I love how she just doesn't say anything, and then just leaves. But the very ending. It was interesting to me when I first saw it. I was very moved by the final scene, which kind of plays out as the credits run. And when she goes towards him, I was thinking, you know, if they were to kiss right now, I'd really like that. But when they didn't, I thought that is so much better. I'm so glad they went that way, because it gives you that, I don't know if it's a note of ambiguity, but it doesn't finalize anything. It's a hint of what she might go on to do. You know, maybe she just goes back to stay there longer. I don't know. Maybe she decides to pursue this life, or maybe she decides to see how things go with him. I don't think anything is final, but the release comes from her making a decision to maybe follow her heart a little bit more than she had been doing previously, which could tie into where she says that she likes her job, but it's not something that she lives for. So perhaps this kind of final moment of going back symbolically is like, she's gonna follow what she believes might be more fulfilling to her, whether that means him, whether that means the place, the lifestyle, or all of those things. So I don't think personally it's like she's going to go off and get married with him, and that's kind of the goal. I think it's more about her personal growth and, again, the independence you're speaking about.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yes, I think it's not just the idea of her getting together with him, which is I think the most reasonable reading that I can make of that particular end moment. It's, I think, the whole package of that lifestyle and that world, which she has obviously been longing for ever since she was young. And and actually I don't think that, how should I put it? It's not necessarily the relationship with him through which she would get the ultimate fulfillment in her journey, right? It's exactly what you said. It's what he not represents, but what he is a part of, or it's the world in which he is also an integral part. And so, and it's that world, or it's that way of living, or it's that way of thinking that I think she's yearning for or longing for. And I think that story at the end with the young boy that she was having a little bit of trouble with, and expressing that idea that maybe she isn't a nice person, and how he, in a way, corrects her or teaches her in a very stern way, I might add. He is not sugarcoating any of what he says. He is very almost impatient with her, as he is trying to explain how he thinks that whole situation, how that little boy really must have felt towards her, and and there's that moment of recognition where after we see her and the little boy meeting, and we realize that the boy is really putting on airs. He wants to act tough, but he's obviously in a very, very difficult situation. We assume maybe his family situation is maybe not so well off, and so rather than say anything to him, she just stands there, and then she even acknowledges it later. All she could do is just turn around and walk away and sort of mimic his behavior. And she sort of says, maybe and I think the implication is that maybe she should have said something, but she didn't. All she could do is just walk away and just do that little thing with the fake spitting to the side or something like that. But it's a similar sort of thing that's going on here, where she just runs away from that whole business of the old woman asking her, do you want to stay here with us and marry Toshio? And she doesn't answer. She just runs away. And so I think there's a kind of a mirroring going on, and she acknowledges that. It's almost like she acknowledges that, yes, I really actually ran away from that situation. And Toshio in that moment doesn't say anything, but he gives a little nod, as though, I'm not sure if it means that he necessarily agrees with what he says, or it's just maybe he's more acknowledging that, oh yes, she is now finally coming to terms with what the situation was. And I think also it's that moment when the sun, or when the rain stops, and I mean, it's because it's night, there's no sun, but the rain stops and things become clear again. So, but I think in that moment, yes, Toshio becomes almost a stern teacher to her. And she acknowledges as such as on the drive back, doesn't she, when she's thinking to herself and says, at that moment, he's younger than she is, but he seemed much older than she was at that moment. And the person that she ended up wanting to shake hands with was, in fact, Toshio. And she has that moment where she says, is it just only shaking hands that I'm thinking of? And so I think that whole story of her running away, or not necessarily saying something when she felt that she really should have, is mirrored in the present day, and it's Toshio who it really sort of symbolically brings her back. And so I think marrying Toshio isn't the point. I think the point is that it's that lifestyle, and it's that it's what he represents and what he brings to her, and how and his place in her journey, so to speak. So it's not necessarily about the marriage itself, but he is an integral component in the journey as we see it in the film. So, but you said it much better than I did. So,
no, like I said, like the romance is not too prevalent. Like he's not too forward with it. It's not like at the forefront of the story. It's there. The potential of it is simmering in the background, perhaps. And obviously, it becomes a pivotal point of the ending, if you want to view it that way. But I feel it's more about her own personal journey, and the thing that really touches me in that final scene as the credits roll is how her younger self turns up. And I'm not sure if she entirely interacts with her on the train, but when she gets off the bus and the bus drives off and all the kids are there and her younger self is there, and then the young Taeko grabs the adult Taeko by the arm and pulls her a little bit, just pulls her by the cuff of her jumper, and it's almost like, you know, herself saying to herself, "Come on, let's follow your heart a little bit." And again, for me, not in terms of a relationship, but something that you've maybe been yearning for. And there's also a moment when she is given the prospect of marriage and she runs away, and I think she says something like she feels embarrassed about how she's been showing herself being interested in farming. There's a much more eloquent way of putting it, but you know, she almost feels like, am I a sham? You know, am I kind of putting this on that I enjoy all of this? But she very clearly does. There's that scene when she first arrives and she just gets right into it, and the sun comes up and she kind of does the little prayer. It's almost like a religious experience for her. You know, she kind of feels, it seems like she feels in her element a little bit. But yeah, it's a personal journey, I think, for sure. And I just was really touched by that notion of your younger self kind of giving you that nudge. And in the film, you literally see that in kind of an actual depiction, which is interesting.
Yes, I think it happens. I want to say twice in that moment. In the second time is when what you mentioned. The first time is when she's on the train a little bit, and her younger self goes up to her, next to her on the seat there, and sort of grabs her by the arm, I think, very gently. Yeah. So I think, yeah. And but you also bring up in that comment, I think, a really, really important point too, which is what I was mentioning earlier, which is, what did I say? The glorification of the countryside or of the farming life, and how Taeko seems to be acknowledging that maybe she is just latching on to the sort of fantasy version of the farm life. And I think that is that's implicit in the film, because I think a lot of that is true in terms of how she views that lifestyle. It's like something that she can just visit for a week,
exactly,
and then return to her cosmopolitan urban lifestyle. And is that really an appreciation, at least the way she seems to be expressing it in the film, or is it just like what she might be saying to herself at the end? Is it just her way of looking good to all of us who are watching the film and watching her be the main character? And I think her realization that could be even a thing going on in the film, I think, is really profound. And the film actually helps us along the way in trying to explain to us that this farming lifestyle is not all wine and roses, because Toshio goes into a really great speech after they leave Zao, the resort town, and they drive and they stop along the way, and they take a break and they look over the mountainside, or they look across the scenery there. And she's saying, "Oh, I love the countryside." And Toshio says, "Yeah, but it's not just about nature. You know, farmers built this. Farmers were responsible for these trees and the river and the planting and everything. And so it's all over many, many, many years of their hard work and forming the land and working with the land. And then soon after that, we get a shot of the two of them planting in a paddy, and she's expressing, "Oh, I'm so tired, you know, my back is sore, and this is not what I thought of when you're talking about organic farming," or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's just a little thing about how this isn't all just fun. It's not just playing around and doing having a fun time, but it's also hard work, hard labor, and it has a certain element of stress to it as well. And actually, it's not overt, but I like how the film deals with that. And I think what you mentioned about Taeko and how she really feels about the farm life, I think is a big element to that. And ultimately, the decision that she makes at the end is therefore it's not just about marrying Toshio, but it's about accepting this way of life in a really true way, which is to actually go to that life and live in it rather than just be a visitor to it.
Yeah, at the beginning of the film, she's kind of raring to go. As soon as she arrives on the farm, she doesn't want to sleep. She's been traveling all night, so she's really up for it. And just the idea of taking a holiday from work to go and work to me just seems like lunacy. But it speaks so much to her character. But as you say, it doesn't. It isn't all that. It's something else as well. So it gives you kind of both sides of it, where she is really willing to do this, and she is a hard worker, and she finds it fulfilling and interesting, but she also maybe gets a little bit tired of it when she's been confronted with the whole spectrum, perhaps. So it kind of, I like how it feels like a very human depiction of a character, where she feels certain things. She has doubts. She's not sure. Am I a nice person? Am I just being nice? And the film doesn't really answer these questions, but it just gives you all of this texture of her character, so you can kind of decide for yourself, I suppose. And it's the general impression you get of her through a 2-hour movie that hopefully would have you invested in that final moment. Speaking of that final moment, I remember the first time I saw it, because she gets on the train and then she moves seats or something, and then the credits just appear on screen. I'm like, oh no, it's over. And I thought, I don't mind that it ended there, but I would have liked something more. And just the way it continued, it gives you that little epilogue throughout the credits. I think it was just so satisfying. And even again, it doesn't wrap everything up in a neat little bow. I think it appears to wrap everything up in a neat little bow. But, I think the future is very uncertain for her. But there's that choice that she makes, which is a choice that she clearly hasn't made up until that point, where she is just working in a job that she doesn't find very fulfilling and doesn't have perhaps a life with too much direction. But she seems very happy-go-lucky all the same. But I like that at the very end we do see those moments of doubt from her, where she is beginning to think things a bit more seriously, perhaps, and not fantasizing that farm life.
Oh yes, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. Yeah, I can't add anything more to that. I think that's very well said.
The music is great. I don't know who did the music, but I really like the soundtrack. It's very subtle. Again, with some of the other Ghibli films, it's very sweeping and grand and beautiful, but the music here is very just delicate and seems to fit the story. I'm not sure if it says on the back.
Yes, so there's a lot of stuff actually that's used in the soundtrack of this.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and there's a kind of original musical motif in the film, but of course there are many songs that are lifted, or not lifted, but they're taken from actual songs used, or TV themes from the 60s that are used. Certain songs that were very popular at the time, and also, in fact, even in the present day, there were some, the what is that instrument? The pan flute.
I love pan flute.
Which is the zamfir. Those are taken from zamfir themes, and so the whole that. Some of the themes that are used, especially to associate with Toshio and the farming ethic, are those themes. And I actually, it's a really wonderful, very eclectic mix of musical tones and styles. It works very well. And then the end song as well, over the credits, I think is a song. I want to say it was performed for Ghibli, but it was performed for purposes of the song of this film. But it works very well.
It says the music is by Masaru Hoshi. And the theme song is performed by Harumi Miyako.
The theme song, which is, you're talking about the song that was performed over the end credits. Yes.
Was the kind of the TV stuff, was that familiar to you? Did that kind of?
Yeah. It's there's some stuff. I want to be very clear. I have the CD soundtrack actually.
Oh, nice.
It's a really great soundtrack, and there are some songs that are used in the background that were maybe that were popular tunes at the time. There are also some TV themes that I didn't see the TV show. My mother did, and but I know kind of what it is. It's kind of famous here in Japan, so I know the theme song, or at least I recognize the theme song when it was played. It actually, she sings it. Taeko sings it when her mother tells her after the whole disappointment with the theater. And then Taiko saying, "Oh, another girl was chosen for the role," and she was all bragging about it in school. And then she was wearing this huge costume, and then her mother abruptly cuts her off and says, "Taiko, I don't want you to tell anyone that you were considered first, because it would be really bad for that little girl," or something like that. But we really know why her mother's saying this, which is because she just wants to forget about this whole episode.
Yeah.
And which is a really just a devastating thing. But the song that she sings at the end there to pick herself up, that's theme song. The what is it? The puppets that the TV show that she was seeing at the time that the guy from the university came and visited the house, inviting her to perform. So it's that puppet theater TV show. It's that theme song. So that's a very famous TV show. It's no longer on air, but it's very famous.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing that really struck me about the film was her parents when she was a kid. Really interesting characters, I thought. On the surface, it might seem like, at least the father, there's not much to him, but I think there's so much to that father character that I think maybe informs how the mother character is as well. Because there's a lot of times where the mother is very stern and almost maybe you might perceive as unreasonable. They go into the thing in school where the kids they can only leave one thing on their plate, and I think one of the young girls mentions the Vietnam War or something. So there's this kind of general feeling of that time where you have to appreciate the food that you've got and everything. And so Taiko is a bit of a picky eater, and her mother's not very happy about that, and she's very stern. There's a heartbreaking moment when they're kind of upset over her performance in maths. And they say something like, well, I forget what her mother says. It's when she's washing the dishes or something. And Taiko walks down the stairs and she overhears it. What was it she said? It was something really horrible.
Yeah, the elder sister comes. Taiko's supposed to learn from the elder sister about how to divide fractions. And then, the middle sister. And she runs down. The middle sister runs down to the kitchen, so shocked. How could she not understand how this works? This isn't normal. And then the mother responds, Taiko isn't normal. And that's at that moment that Taiko's seen walking down the steps. So she's heard everything that they've said, in particular what the mother says. And the mother doesn't even apologize to her. She just says, yeah, why don't you just go learn from your sister about how to divide these fractions? Yeah, it was just because you had a headache, right? That's why, yeah. It was a terrible moment. What a terrible moment.
And then, of course, the scene where the father slaps her, and that's just like, I can identify with those, not the slapping, but the moments where you're a kid and you're being petulant and, you're kind of biting your nose off to spite your face, where, you just got disagreements with your family, and then it's that moment where they say, okay, fine, we'll go without you then. And then she realizes, oh, I didn't want that. So she runs out, but she isn't wearing shoes, and so he slaps. Oh god, just the way that they kind of animated that with the kind of the bruising on her face, or the kind of scuff mark, and it's just horrible. But obviously there's not too much depth there as those the parental figures go, but it shows you very clearly her childhood. But I don't know, I don't feel like the father's painted in a completely negative light, but I just get the sense that I feel like he's very he's got a lot of stress on him. There's like a lot of weight on his shoulders. I don't know. And then I feel like the mother kind of, it transfers to her as well, like when they're talking about the acting. And the mother seems quite receptive to it. And then the father's just like, no acting. And the mother seems very like, well, I guess, there's that look on her face. It's the details. The look on her face is like, well, I guess that's that then. If he says no, then that's it.
Oh, yes. There was it was when the family were just over talking it and just saying, oh yeah, you can have a career in acting or something. And that was probably just taking it one step too far for the father.
Yeah.
So that's why Taeko is complaining. Why did you have to say all that stuff afterwards and all that stuff? But even that, there's one brief moment where the mother says, "There's no," she kind of gently tries to push back against the father at that moment, but to no avail, of course, because he really puts his foot down. But yeah, I would agree that there's actually a lot of depth to the father figure, and actually I would say that there's a lot of depth to the mother figure as well. It's not like she is. It's not like she is wholly a bad mother.
No, definitely not.
Yeah, I mean right. There's a great moment where early in the film, Taeko is talking about how she wrote an essay and how it was really well received in school, and she's really beaming and just happy and just talking about it. And then in the middle of the conversation, her mother realizes or discovers that Taeko didn't put some pickles in the bread and didn't eat it. And so rather than talk about the essay, she's talking about, the mother's just focusing in on, you don't eat everything, you're such a bad girl or something like that. And it's kind of a subtle moment, but it's still quietly devastating. So you think, oh gosh, maybe this mother figure is not necessarily listening to the needs of her youngest child. But in that scene later, much later in the film, when the family's talking about Taeko's acting success, even if it's for a brief moment, her mother mentions the essay contest, and so her essay writing, and so it was something that the mother obviously remembered or was maybe we can assume that maybe she was even proud of her daughter about that moment. So it's not like she is necessarily just overbearing and uncaring, I would suggest, but maybe she is, she has other concerns about her daughter. Of course, she wants her daughter to do well in school. I think every parent would want their children to do well in school, of course, and all this stuff. But there are definitely moments of, that relationship between Taeko and her mother, I think, is a really complicated one. And it's interesting, too, that we never see her mother in the present day scenes. We only hear about her, but we never see her. We never see any other family member, in fact. But I would suggest that the relationship with her mother, the relationship with her father, of course, and the relationship with each of her sisters is very important. And also I should mention, too, that the grandmother is very interesting. The grandmother has a very, very, very small role, but if you recall in the episode where they're talking about the handbag, and they're all having their little petty little back and forths about the handbag around the dinner table. And then all of a sudden the grandmother says, you three children are selfish, or something like that. Yeah. You're all selfish. And everyone just goes silent, just cuts to her just sipping on her tea. And that's it. We never get a sense of that ever again. But actually, I think there's a really deep thing that's going on there, because if we remember her age, we can assume that the grandmother would have lived through the war, the Pacific War, or World War II, and that period in the 30s and 40s, and it was the aftermath, of course, for Japan. Very, very difficult times in many, many senses of that word, and so we can assume that she lived through that. And I think there's so much of that generational gap. And it really goes to a kind of consumerist or consumerism that is on display in the late 1960s versus the older generation in that one subtle, brief, but very important moment. So in other words, there's so much there's so much that's left unspoken with respect to all of these familial relationships, but at the same time, as you suggest very rightly, it's very, very deep.
Yeah, I just think that on the surface it might seem quite two-dimensional. Parents who are kind of tough on her and stuff, and I think the mother more so. There's a lot more depth there, but with the father, I found it even more subtle. The scene when she's refusing to go out and he stood outside smoking a cigarette, and my initial reaction is, oh god, he's gonna flip out when he sees that she's refusing to leave. But he comes in very calmly and says, "You're gonna come with us," and she refuses, and he stands there for a very long time. It feels like just thinking, and then he just says okay, and he just leaves. but it's when she then goes out again that he slaps her. And you could have Taeko say in the present day, "Oh, my dad wasn't a bad guy or anything." She doesn't say that. But she just says he only hit me once, which tells you that he obviously really regretted that, and we don't see that. But so just very subtle details, I think, that do. If you think about it as much as we think about films, I think maybe you can see the depth to some of that. But I found that her relationship with her parents was very interesting throughout the film, and interesting how you mentioned again we don't see them as she's an adult. But being a 10-year-old, it's a tough time for most kids. Just you going through a lot of stuff, and so you can understand why she has a tough time as a kid, but perhaps even more so in certain time periods of the 1960s, perhaps. Yeah, and I didn't think about that with the grandmother, that she had definitely lived through the war. That obviously informed her comment about them being selfish. And again, the little thread of the kids in school being forced to eat their food and be thankful for what they've got and stuff.
While there's a sort of time here, may I ask you? I don't. Maybe it's too early for this, but where does this film fall for you amongst all of the Ghibli films?
That's an interesting one. Very tricky. I mean, I love the film. I think it's brilliant. I think it's kind of a masterpiece, really, which is a very overused term, but I would say it. I don't know. It's not a film I could watch all the time, like other Ghibli films, perhaps, but I feel like it's a film that I get more out of, perhaps, as an adult. I don't know. It's intriguing. I would. I'd say top 10 at least. I mean, there's what, 22, 23 Ghibli films, something like that. I'd say it's definitely in the top 10. I don't know if it'd be top 5 because I have such a love and passion for some other ones, but it's up there. And now that I've watched it again, my passion for it has kind of been reinvigorated. So I'd have to think about it, but it's definitely in the top half for sure. How about you?
Interesting. Oh, I think it's
Really high.
I haven't really decided on an actual definitive list, but it could be my favorite Ghibli film. I absolutely adore this film. I think I think it's almost perfect.
Okay.
I would say for by the only I don't even I think it's a flaw, but the only thing that I go back and forth on is the relationship, the what happens at the end with her and Toshio.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And how that figures into her whole journey.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of the point. It's not meant to be a nice bow tied around this, neatly, but I think it's meant to be a little bit, as you mentioned, ambiguous. And so when I look at it that way, it becomes a perfect film. But then I look at it in another way and I think, is this really the best thing for her? I don't know if this is really the best thing for her at this moment. I mean, I'm trying to be as honest as possible, as much as I love the film and I want her to be happy, of course. Is this really the best thing for her at this particular moment in time? Or is there a better course of action? I'm not sure. But those sorts of things, I think, that questioning, though, I think maybe is an indication of how effective this film is for me. So maybe I should have phrased it not in the sense of going back and forth and affecting its level of perfection for me, but rather it making me think in this way makes it a perfect film, I think.
Well, I would counter that a little, that maybe it's more about her trying something different, not necessarily the end result, and that her going off is this happily ever after, but it's the decision to make a choice, to follow her heart maybe a little bit more than she had done before. So yeah, for me, I don't think it's all wrapped up in the romance or even in like an end point. It's just for this period of her life, she's reconnected with herself in some kind of deep way. And I think at one point she says that at some point on this trip, my 10-year-old self decided to join me, that kind of thing. Two things I wanted to mention, just very small things that I kind of enjoyed, was in the section about the period and the girl's getting the period for the first time, and she's hanging out with this girl who had already had her period, so she's kind of confident about it, and she's not too phased about the boys teasing them. Like the ball rolls over to them, and the boy's like, "Oh, you'll catch your period." And the girl finds that very funny, like, "Oh, that's so ridiculous." But Taiko's just like mortified. She is so like embarrassed by this, and it affects her in a completely different way. And you have a girl who's the same age as her, but has more experience, and so you can imagine she learns from that. In the present timeline, Taiko's a very happy-go-lucky person. It seems, at least on the surface, she isn't phased by things too much. When Toshio was like talking and talking, and he's like, "Oh, sorry," she's like, "No, no, it's fine." She's very easygoing. So it shows you that she's learned from some of those experiences, but also at the end that she can learn maybe something from him too. And a very minor thing, there's a bossy girl in school who has these very sharp ponytails. And I just thought that was a really fun way of kind of depicting her character. She's a very sharp personality. She's a very bossy young girl. I just thought the ponytails are just like almost like they look brittle, like they're firmly in place. Whereas Taiko's hair is very kind of soft, and I don't know. I like that the design of it, I suppose. But
Yeah, I like that character. Her name is the last name is Tani, and she's the one who says in the class meeting, she's the one who mentions Vietnam and how the
yeah,
kids
that's right.
shouldn't
Yeah,
leave the food behind, or they should eat everything. She also mentions in that same class meeting about how people who are hall monitors should be allowed to run after people who are running in the hall, and people who are running in the hall are obviously breaking the rules, and we should stop this. Running in the hall is bad. But we see a couple scenes later her actually running in the hall before a friend of hers catches her and says, "Oh, I can't do this," and she just walks almost devilishly. Yeah,
yeah.
she's a very interesting character. Yeah.
And then one last thing, how did you feel about the pacing of the sections of the film, the past and present? Because I think that it's a little uneven at times. Like sometimes we'll be with the childhood sequences for so long that when we come back, I kind of forget not forget where I was, but it feels a little bit uneven. But to me, because I love the character and the story so much, I don't really mind that. I'm happy to spend time in either of the timelines, and I think it levels out more towards the section when she gets to the farm, I think. But how do you feel about that? Maybe you disagree.
Are you talking about the actual amount of time
Yeah,
given to? Oh, I see. Well, of course, I think it varies as the film goes on. The film starts with more focus on the past
yeah,
scenes, and then I mean it's not a perfect gradual progression, but it tends to go more with a focus on the present scenes as we get on. But that's not really a perfect way of describing it. But there's a bit in the middle where it really focuses on the present scenes,
yeah,
this present story, right? When she arrives in Yamagata and she settles in. That's actually, I think, the longest sequence in either storyline, I think. But I don't think there's any issue to that. I think there's I mean, the film has a certain structure which I think is pretty well organized. I mean, there's a structure of her on in Tokyo, and then all the way up to her sleeping that night. That's the first section, and then the second section is really her in Yamagata, or arriving in Yamagata, and then going through the daily motion of the lifestyle there. And then the third section is this sort of reaching a climactic moment with her and being confronted with this choice, as you put it, the choice of staying or the choice of going back. So I think it's really divided nicely into these sections. And there are many different ways of looking at it, of course, but I think if we look at it that way, I think that the organization works very nicely. I think anyway.
yeah. Well, I think it's uneven, but I appreciate that because it feels more realistic. It feels like that kind of spotty dipping into the daydreaming of memories and stuff that you have in real life. So I kind of, and again, because I just enjoy it so much. And one last thing, As you're saying, the scene when she's talking about the countryside and how beautiful it is, and he's saying, well, don't forget that man made most of this in terms of the way that the farming land has been transformed. Very weird aside, but I was watching a documentary about Easter Island recently, and I was fascinated to learn that they're looking into it, and apparently there was like just lots of forest on that island initially that is just gone, like millions of trees, and they're just talking about how man at some point must have cut all these trees down, but why and how, you know. And so it does make you think. Like you look at nature and you think, wow, this is. I mean, you can look at mountains, they're untouched, but a lot of countryside is kind of formed by man's imprint, and it's a very small aside in the film. But I like those little things that make you think about the way that you look at the world, I think. So the film has a little bit of that in there. And it doesn't get too thick on it either. It doesn't go too much into the agricultural aspects, as far as like the technical details and thinking about it too much. And as far as the countryside goes, I think those sections of the film look gorgeous. Really goes without saying that most of these Ghibli films look pretty stunning, but it's also like the childhood stuff is very muted in tone, like I said, but also subtle. It just, I don't know, there's something about it that's a little bit different than the other ones. But you will have the occasional, like, gorgeous shot of, like, the safflowers with, like, the glistening dew on the leaves, just, like, really nice stuff. But a lot of it is just focused on character, just the facial expressions and stuff. So it has those gorgeous kind of vistas, but it also is very, very focused on the characters, too. So I guess we're kind of winding down here. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts on the film? In fact, actually, I'll just cut in there. I mean, we've done 3 of these now. How would you rank them? Let's just do that for now. It might get difficult if we continue to do this, but how would you rank the 3 that we've done so far as Porco Rosso, Kiki's Delivery Service, and Only Yesterday? It's a tricky one, isn't it?
Very difficult.
Yeah.
It's...
And 3 very different films as well.
That's correct, yes. I mean, the third place film for me, it might sound like I don't like it because I've put it third, but I love it very much, but it's third place because there are the 2 other films in consideration. Very close, but it's going to be Porco Rosso as third, and then Kiki's Delivery Circus second, and then Only Yesterday first.
Yeah, I think I'd put Porco at the top, then Kiki, then Only Yesterday. But I think if that's personal preference, I think if we're talking which is the best film, I think Only Yesterday might be the best of those 3. Just I feel like it's such an accomplished piece, even if I love the other 2 a little bit more. And it's been great revisiting this one. I definitely wanted to watch it again before we talked about it. So closing thoughts on the film then, if you want to kind of take us out on kind of anything else you'd like to add before we finish up.
Well, I think just a closing thought on the film is really how the film closes. The film closes in a way that really makes us wonder what will happen to these characters in the future. I think in a way that is very powerful and very lasting. And it does have a sense of completeness on the one hand, you're absolutely right, but there is a sense of uncertainty. And I think we're not quite sure what's going to happen. We won't know exactly what's going to happen. We can only surmise, or we can only make a best guess. But I think that is an example of how well structured this film is and how powerful this is. The fact that we can still think about these characters long after the film is over and wonder exactly what will happen to them. And will they in fact make it? And are they happy? Or is there something else that's going on in their lives? But the point with that is this feels like a film that is kind of a capsule of a certain point in time or times, because we have 2 time periods. But it's also a living kind of film. And I really love this about Ghibli films, but in particular about this film, because for me there is something very much alive about this film. It's a film that feels very lived in. It's a film that feels real and down to earth, even with its, as you expressed it very, very appropriately, I think, even with its magical realism moments. this is a film that still feels like it's reflecting a kind of self-reflection or a journey through a very significant part in one's life that I think everyone who watches this film in some form or another can identify with and can really connect with. And to combine that with the details about Japanese culture in the late 60s, or even the present day story with the 27-year-old Taeko and the Yamagata lifestyle, which is all taken from actual places and actual things, I think it's a fascinating document. It's a universal film on the one hand, and it's a very Japanese film on the other hand, because of these details about Japanese society. And I think all this is just a wonderful example of Takahata at his really finest, and also Ghibli at its finest. So only yesterday, if anyone for whatever reason has sat through this entire conversation between Luke and myself and not yet seen the film, then I urge you to see the film. I'm sorry that our conversation spoiled it for you, but Luke did warn you in advance. But if there's anyone who still hasn't seen the film, it is very much worth watching. I would contest that it is one of, if not, my favorite Ghibli film, and it's certainly one of the best Ghibli films out there. It is certainly one of Takahata's best films, and Takahata is a master of not only animation, not only of cinema, but of Japanese cinema. He is a voice that is already so missed, but he left behind a great body of work, including Only Yesterday. So yes, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I would agree completely, especially with the summary of Takahata. I mean, I haven't seen all of his films yet. I think that there's a few from the Ghibli. I mean, which ones have I seen? So I've seen Grave of the Fireflies, this one, Princess Kaguya. I feel like there's something else. Maybe it's just those three. Maybe those three just leave such a big impression on me that I feel like I've seen more of his work than I actually have. But I think they're three masterpieces in completely different ways. Completely different. And Only Yesterday, I think, really stands, I wouldn't say taller, but it stands apart from a lot of the other Ghibli films just in how different it is. And this kind of story in general, animation or not, looking back on your past and kind of connecting with your younger self. There's a recent film that I've saw that I won't spoil what it is because it's kind of a spoiler in of itself, but it's about someone who's kind of helped by their younger self in some strange way. And I love that theme in visual storytelling, and so with this film I think it works wonderfully. And it's just it's such an involving personal film. It really, just little moments will just remind me of things when I was a kid. It's almost like two coming of age stories in one movie that isn't a coming of age story. When she's 10 she's not coming of age really, and when she's 27 she's not really coming of age, but it's about this character who's moving on to something else perhaps, and it's the hint of that. And we just see the period in which she begins to kind of be helped by her own past self and her own memories. And memory is like, it's the most important thing about being human. I think without memory do we have emotion? I don't know, in the immediate maybe, but memory is everything. It's the key to our kind of human condition, and this film is all about memories and how that informs the present as much as you feel it in your past. So I think it's a great film, and I love that final note because you can read it in different ways. If for you the story is more fulfilling as this romantic story completed, that's fine. You can view it that way. But if you want to look a little bit deeper and you want to, maybe you don't agree with that, then you can view it that way. I think the film leaves it very open in that sense. Although I do think there is a bit more intention towards it being more about her internal journey as such. But yeah, it was great to revisit it. It was awesome to talk to you about it and get some of your perspective. So thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you. The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for inviting me. As always, let's do this again.
Yes, definitely. Hopefully sooner than the last time. And yeah, there's so many great films to choose from. So I look forward to doing it again. And you can go check out Daisuke's channel. It's awesome. Very prolific YouTuber. He puts out a lot of videos. Doesn't sacrifice the quality. Definitely. I mean, if you're watching this far, you probably are well familiar with his channel anyway. So just kindly send you over to his channel. Put links in the description and everything to his channel. and the previous two discussions that we've done. So that's it. So thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and thanks again.
Thank you.